Our next speaker is Dr. Karen Blair. Dr. Karen Blair is an award-winning professor and scholar at St. Francis Xavier University, where she is an assistant professor of psychology and a Jules Léger Research Chair in Humanities and Social Sciences. She has more than 30 publications, 14 invited addressees, including international keynotes, and was awarded the Outstanding Faculty Teaching Award this past spring at St. FX. Her work focuses on intergroup relationships and health, including LGBT communities, hate communities, and that of mass shootings. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Karen Blair.
Over the past year, I've been the target of an online cyberbullying attack. This attack grew in its intensity, rather ironically, right as I was about to embark on a 2-week Holocaust study trip this summer. While I was sitting on my plane in Toronto, ready to fly off to Berlin, my Twitter feed was blowing up. And it was blowing up with some of the most hateful messages. I've somewhat censored the ones that I'll share. But basically, they were asking me how I could be so stupid, saying that I was a disgrace to my field, that they would destroy me, and that they were coming to get me. They said I was a soul eater. I'm not sure what that one is. They said that I was living evidence that universities had become cesspools of brainwashed liberal ideologies. So I don't know if there's an ideal or perfect or proper state of mind that you're supposed to be in when you're about to embark on a Holocaust study trip. But I'll tell you that the state of mind that these attacks left me in made me all the more cognizant of the power of words. Because I hope that we know that the Holocaust began with words. It's a phrase that's been uttered by so many that it's difficult to attribute the phrase to any one person anymore. But I know that I have never met a Holocaust survivor who didn't in some way share this message as part of their story. However, I'm worried. I'm worried that we do not fully understand what this phrase means. When I began teaching about the Holocaust, I assumed that this number meant the same thing to everybody that it means to me. However, it turns out that I was wrong. A recent national survey in Canada found that 62% of Canadians between the ages of 18 and 34 could not correctly identify 6 million as the number of Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. Things didn't get much better among Canadians over 35. And in my own research at St. FX, where I've been following the Holocaust knowledge of second-year psychology students for the last 3 years, things are only marginally better, with 1/3 being unable to identify this number from a multiple choice question. In fact, over 10% selected a number of 100,000 or less. This is what 100,000 dots looks like next to 6 million dots. It's off, and it's off by quite a bit. But what do students know? Well, they know that the Holocaust is an event that took place during World War II, or at least one of the world wars. They know that it involved Germany, the Nazis, Hitler, and the Jews. Very few are able to name any other concentration camp other than Auschwitz, and very few can name victims other than Anne Frank. They lack a basic understanding of the chronology of events that made up the Holocaust, and even more so, they lack an understanding of the precipitating events that made the Holocaust possible. Further, the less Holocaust knowledge they have, the less likely they are to be offended by Holocaust denial, and the more likely they are to be supportive of alt-right ideologies. All of this taken together concerns me, and I think it should concern you too. But why? Why should we really actually be so worried that our knowledge of a historical event that took place 80 years ago is declining? Well, I argue that Holocaust education gives us a roadmap, the roadmap that we need to navigate uncertain times right now, and that we will need again in the future when we meet more uncertain times. But how will we do that? How will we do that if we lack an understanding of the basic elements that made up the Holocaust and that made it possible. If we don't have that information, how will we live up to the promise of never again? Right now, we're standing on the bit of a ledge of a new frontier in Holocaust education. We're standing at a time when very soon it will no longer be possible to bring in living, breathing Holocaust survivors to speak to our students. And this has served as a cornerstone of Holocaust education for decades. As the Washington Post recently put it, as the last Holocaust survivors depart amidst a surge of anti-Semitism, racism, and hate, who will tell their stories? I would add to that, who will know the importance and relevance of their stories? So today I'd like to share with you 4 ideas that I have for future-proofing Holocaust education and ensuring that we will be able to live up to the promise of never again. So, if fewer than half of Canadian adults can correctly identify 6 million from a multiple choice question as the number of Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust, something about that number isn't resonating. Because if you truly feel the weight of that number, how could you ever forget it? Perhaps it has something to do with how we are teaching about the Holocaust. Maybe we are allowing ourselves to slip into the standards of just focusing on numbers and dates and names and places. To demonstrate this, I'd like to tell you about one historical event in 2 different ways. And I'll let you be the judge of which one you think might be more powerful and which one might be more memorable. On October 16th, 1943, the Germans in Rome, Italy, went through the Jewish ghetto and rounded up over 1,000 people. They took them to the nearby military college where they held them for a couple of days, and then they shipped them north to Auschwitz, where the majority of them perished. That's one way to tell the story. It's accurate. This is the second way. This is Rina Di Veroli and her brother Adolfo. Rina was born on October 2nd, 1933. She loved to go to school. She went to an all-girls school and she did quite well. She liked to draw flowers, and these are actually flowers that she drew. On the morning of October 16th, 1943, Rina went outside to play with her neighbor. And while she was doing that, the Germans showed up at the door to her apartment and ordered her mother and brother to pack up. Her father was not home at the time. The neighbor's mother noticed this happening and urged Rina to follow along because she didn't want Rina to become separated from her mother and her brother. And so Rina did follow along. And together they ended up in that military college, where they were held in a crowded space with little access to water or food for 2 days. They needed these 2 days because they had to sort out who they had rounded up that might not be Jewish and make sure to let those people go. But once they were sure that everyone left was Jewish, they took them to the main train station in Rome. Perhaps you've been there. I've been there. But it was different. And when they got there, they were loaded onto cattle cars. And they were filled up so that there was no space to sit, no space to lie down. And for a number of grueling days and nights, they traveled this way with no water, no food, no way to relieve themselves, until they arrived at Auschwitz. And when they did arrive at Auschwitz, Rina, being 10, Adolfo, being 8, and their mother Wanda, 29, they didn't stand a chance of entering the camp. They were taken directly to the gas chambers. Along with Rina's maternal grandmother, Rosa, they all perished that same day that they arrived. Giacomo, Rina's grandfather, was likely admitted into the camp, but he too eventually perished. So Rina is one story of 6 million. Adolfo is 2. Wanda is 3. Rosa and Giacomo are 4 and 5 of 6 million. Of the 1,023 individuals who were taken from the Rome ghetto that day to Auschwitz, 16 survived, 15 men and one woman. So this is the story of one. And I hope that you'll see that this story, this version, was much more powerful. And when we start with these individual stories, that's the only way we can ever come close to the 6 million holding the weight that it does. And that 6 million also includes more than 1 million children, like Rena and Adolfo. But Holocaust education is not just about history. We need history. If you're a historian, we need you. We need historical context. We need historical accuracy. These are both very important. But Holocaust education needs to show up in all of our classrooms. It's relevant to so many different topics. There's the obvious contenders like political science and international relations, English, literature, sociology. There's some less obvious ones as well. There's geography. There's architecture. There's molecular biology and the advances that we're making in things like gene editing that bring a whole new form of eugenics into possibility. And one of the areas that I have found most useful in teaching about the Holocaust to my students has been art. There's something about art that can tell us more than any written word or even any perfectly directed Spielberg film. There's something unique about art, in particular with Holocaust art, because while we have the stories of survivors who come to speak to us, we're missing the stories of 6 million people who didn't survive. And sometimes all that they left behind was a little piece of art. Often art that they risked their lives to make so that they could make that record and hope that one day we'd be sitting here looking at it. And so I've found art to be very useful in connecting my students to this story. And this leads me to think that Holocaust education needs to be interdisciplinary, and it needs, whenever possible, to also be immersive, to the extent that immersive is an appropriate word when talking about Holocaust education. This picture here is a group of my students on a study trip sitting and learning in the very place where the decision was made to murder the Jews of Europe. And that's a different experience than just reading about it. It's a qualitatively different experience to read about a massacre that takes place in a forest versus to stand there in that same forest, in the very same spot, to feel the same ground under your feet, to look up at the same sky, to see the same trees, and to watch them blow in the wind, knowing that they very likely might be exactly the same trees that were there during the event that you're learning about. So I think that there's a real important need for as much of this type of learning as we can possibly afford. There's also no such thing as monsters. Any Holocaust education must, of course, make victims central to the story. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't also learn about the perpetrators. If Holocaust education can be a map to navigating our uncertain times of now and in the future, what good is a map going to do us if it only tells us where to find the victims? We also need a map that's going to tell us where to find the perpetrators, but also what path led them to becoming perpetrators. In popular culture, we tend to portray Nazis as zombies, as monsters, as the embodiment of pure evil. But they actually weren't. They were human. They were just as human as you and just as human as me. One of the most profound things that I notice in my students as we learn about the Holocaust together is that at the beginning of the course, they always think that they're going to be the rescuer. They think that if they had lived during the time of the Holocaust, they definitely would have rescued people. By the end of the course, they realize that at best they would have been bystanders, and at worst, with a great degree of probability, they probably would have been perpetrators. If we want to understand the Holocaust as a roadmap that can help us with our own uncertain times, then we cannot give in to the temptation of seeing the Holocaust as a tragedy that was committed by other worldly beings. We must acknowledge the shared humanness between us and the Nazis that perpetrated the Holocaust. Yes, they enacted pure evil, but they were not. And I would extend this to say that we must also recognize the shared humanity between us and the Nazis that continue to be amongst us today. This brings me to my final point, which is that never again is now. Hashtag #NeverAgainIsNow has become a controversial hashtag that people add to their social media posts when they want to make some sort of comparison between current events or current world leaders and the Holocaust. And it's controversial because to some, they see this as being inappropriate, that to do so is disrespectful, and that it cheapens the memory of 6 million to make these kinds of comparisons. And I would agree that the Holocaust should never be invoked lightly. It must always be invoked with careful consideration and great deal of accuracy. However, never again is now. And I think that the difference between seeing this hashtag as controversial and seeing it as completely appropriate may have something to do with the detail of our Holocaust knowledge. If your understanding of the Holocaust begins and ends with the gas chambers, the concentration camps, and mass shootings, or even with mass deportations and ghettos, then I can understand why you would see these comparisons as being inappropriate. Because by and large, with a few exceptions, very few of the current events and world leaders that we have today rise quite to this level. However, if your understanding of the Holocaust is that it began with words, if it began by dividing us versus them, if it began by using words to write laws that would limit the freedoms of some, if it began by limiting and changing and altering the public narrative, then I think it's much more easy to see the relevance and accuracy of making these types of comparisons. Using words to divide our world into us versus them charts a path that can lead to the destruction of our very humanity. So yes, the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers or with mass shootings, not even with mass deportations or limits on immigration. The Holocaust began by using words to define us versus them. It began by using words to encourage the masses to scapegoat a minority and to blame that minority for their own misfortunes. It began by using words to write laws that took away the rights of some. It began by using words to write movie scripts, movies that millions of Germans went to go and see, that depicted Jews as despicable, dangerous. It also began with words that weren't said. It began with words outside of Germany that failed to welcome and to defend the Jews. In Canada, it began with the words of a politician who, when asked about how many Jewish refugees Canada could take in, the answer was, none would be too many. So never again is now. Never again is now is because we are still, and perhaps never stopped, using words to divide us versus them, to slander and to instill hatred. Never again is now because we now are able to spread that hatred through a medium that was supposed to connect us and make information more accessible, but is really helping us to spread hatred in all sorts of new ways. Never again is now because the same politics, the politics of me over we, the politics of make whatever your country is great again, the politics of us versus them, the same politics that made the Holocaust possible are sweeping the world one nation at a time. The Holocaust is now because tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of 11 Jewish men and women being murdered in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, very close to here. Never again doesn't mean promising that next time around we'll blow up the gas chambers. Never again means promising that we will pay attention to the words that we're using, and that we will ensure that the words that we use aim to share more compassion than hatred. We can't allow the very last Holocaust survivors who are alive today to die without showing them that we understand the magnitude of the task that they've left to us, and without giving them the confidence that we will live up to that promise of never again. Holocaust education can certainly provide a roadmap for navigating our uncertain times today and our uncertain times in the future. But if our Holocaust knowledge continues to decline at the rates that it is, we're not going to know how to read the map. Thank you.